Welcome to PM in the PM. This is the weekly Monday afternoon podcast where I take a news item or something interesting that I've heard in the past week and look at how it links to the ACCA Performance Management Syllabus area. The benefit of listening is you get real world application of what you're learning. This means you're more likely to remember it. You'll give better answers to those application questions. It will help with PM, but it's also going to help if you're doing APM. What are we going to talk about this week? I had something interesting, and it's not necessarily news, but we have a discount retailer called B&M, and they took over one of their competitors, Wilko. Wilko went into administration, B&M bought them out. I was hearing a conversation about this, and I heard the person say that they were a bit confused because Wilko, when they were in operation, reported challenging trading times because they were competing with B&M. And equally, B&M reported challenging trading times because they're in competition with Wilko. And this person was a bit perplexed. How can both of those things exist? If I think of it with a PM hat on, with a performance management hat on, I can see how we can understand how both can be challenged. One of them came first, and that company was Wilko. And I believe it was 1930 that entered the UK market, and it wasn't until 1978 that B&M entered the UK market. However, they weren't really in competition. It's only in relatively recent years that both have grown massively and taken on big locations in high streets, in shopping centres. And it was only September 23 when Wilko was taken over by B&M. So although they've both been around for a very long time, it's really only over the past few years that they became in direct competition with each other. And this led me to think about everyone's favourite PM topic, variances. I'm sure most students who are studying PM wish that variances were not part of the syllabus, but they are. They're syllabus D, and there's some specific variances which are called planning and operational variances. A lot of variance questions are calculations, but certainly not all of them. There's a lot of narrative ones, so even if you're struggling with the calculations, you really want to make sure you understand what's going on, because you should still be able to get the marks for those narrative type questions. I can imagine in both of these organisations, they were probably setting budgets. They were expecting sales to be at a certain level, but because of the opening of the competitor store, that sales volume was decreased. And there was probably a manager who is thinking, oh no, I'm not going to get my bonus. This isn't fair. I'm not in control of this. Controllability is a real key point when we're talking about budgets, when we're talking about variances. And they're right, they're not in control. And that's where planning and operational variances come into play. So what exactly do we mean by planning and operational variances? When we're setting a budget, it's always based on assumptions on aspects like the total size of the market. If we make a particular product or line of products, through past experience, we can forecast what we expect our sales to be. But then what if something changes? What if there's a high inflation like we had a few years back? What if there's a radical change in the way customers behave? Perhaps an online competitor comes along, and Amazon being a very obvious one, where the market for the high street was taken away in a big part by this online retailer. What about if a competitor sets up next door to us? Our market size that we've based our budget on is now not useful data. It's incorrect. And if we didn't do anything about it, every month or every quarter would be reporting adverse sales volume variances. And it would be pointless, it would be demotivating, and it wouldn't be very helpful information. If we keep saying sales are 20% down this month compared to budget, we can't do anything with that. We can't make decisions on that because our baseline is now incorrect. We're going to be looking at these variances, and this manager who's trying to perform well, who's doing well, it's going to look like they're not. And that's where planning and operational variances come into play. What we do is we split the variance into two parts. So we have a sales volume variance, but we split it. Part of that variance is due to that change in circumstances that's outside the control of the organisation. And then part of the variance is due to what that manager is doing with the residual market share. So a sales volume planning variance, also known as a market size variance, would then show how much of the variance, how much of the performance for this month or this quarter is adverse due to that circumstance out of our control. It can happen with all of our standard costs as well. Our materials perhaps are based on a particular product specification. What are the design changes? If the design changes, then the material type and amount we'll need should change. If we don't adjust our budget, we're going to be reporting adverse and favourable variances that have nothing to do with the performance of those who are in control. We could split that into a planning variance, and that would take into account that change in specification and would effectively set a new standard of the quantity of material that's needed. And then the operational variance would compare the manager's performance against that new standard. It can happen with labour as well. If we're expecting a certain rate of pay for our staff, for our employees, and let's say a government budget changes, the amount of national insurance or tax that employers need to pay happened very recently in the UK. We're just going to keep reporting adverse variances, and it's nothing to do with anything that's in our control. Again, we could use a planning variance, a labour rate planning variance, would adjust that standard, and then we could compare performance against that revised standard. And then the favourable or adverse aspect against that revised standard would be called the operational variance, the labour rate operational variance. So that's where planning and operational variances come into play. We take the normal variance and we split it to reflect those things that are not controllable. Controllability is a really critical thing to mention when you're looking at variances, when you're looking at budgeting. If we're not meeting a budget, but it's not in control of that manager, we can't hold them accountable for that. It's unfair to do so. It's demotivating to do so. Budgets are meant to help motivate managers to perform, not demotivate them. If we're reporting adverse variances and it's not their fault, it's because of an outside circumstance, they're rightly going to be unhappy about that. They can also be combined with other aspects of the syllabus area, for example, learning rates. If we set our budget on the time needed to produce a batch of goods and it's a newly introduced product, over time we might expect that the people producing that will get faster and faster. If we set our budget based on the time it takes them on the first one, we're going to report favourable variances because they'll be producing more units in the same amount of time. So we're going to have a favourable variance, but it's expected. And so what we could do, and what we should do, is adjust our standard. We should say, well, now we've reached a steady state, the learning effect has finished. We should now recalibrate the standard to reflect that. And that would be a planning variance. So the number of batches that they can produce in a given set of time should now increase. And that would be our planning variance. And then we're once again measuring performance against the new standard. And that would be the operational variance. So this can get tested in different ways. You can be asked to do the calculations to split a variance into planning and operational. You need to think the bit that is not controllable by the managers, that becomes the planning variance. The bit that is in control is the operational variance. And don't be surprised if you've got an adverse variance that once you split it, the planning is adverse, but the operational is favourable. Or you might be asked a narrative question. So you might be asked, what could explain a labour efficiency planning variance? And you might have to choose some answers from a list. So for example, a change in legislation where staff have to take a longer break. It's come from outside the organisation, so it's a planning variance. Perhaps you've had to change the product design because you had too many warranty claims. Again, that's nothing to do with labour efficiency, so that becomes a planning variance. Then the operational variance compares against that new standard. Now, I think that because we've got variances in the name, people panic. But I think operational and planning variances are some of the easier ones to deal with than perhaps mix and yield, which we're not covering today. So we looked a little bit at a couple of discount retail stores and how it can tie into variances and budget and that part of the syllabus area. When you're talking about budgets, when you're talking about variances, always think controllability. Who can control this? This adverse variance, is it this manager's fault? Should they have prevented it? If not, then it shouldn't work against them. If they are in control of it, then they should take responsibility. And we might change the budget because we want it to be acceptable. We want it to motivate. So thanks for listening to PM in the PM. I hope you found this episode informative. As always, please send feedback in the comments and share this with any colleagues who might find it useful. But until next time, this is Richard Guyver signing off.